Welcome to the Short Time Wrestling Podcast, doing this live on rockfin.com. Jason Bryan here with you. Today we are joined by a trailblazer, a individual who has an amazing story that has been chronicled in a new book called Afsoon, written by Craig Sesker. Here, the namesake of that book, Afsoon Johnston. Afsoon, been a while since we last chatted. Welcome to the show, and it's going to be great to talk to you about this wonderful, wonderful book.
Oh, thank you. Hello, Jason, and thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm really excited to be here and to talk to you guys today.
One thing that's interesting is the story that you have to tell. You've told for years, and it's something that's for some small group of people in the wrestling community. They know it. It's something that, oh wow, Afsoon's got this really great story that kind of personifies wrestling and in terms of overcoming hurdles and such. But the opportunity to put it down in print, explain basically the idea and the genesis of putting your story into words, written by Craig Sesker.
Right. No, really good question. So how this came about was, like you said, competing during my years when I was still competing, people became familiar with my story and my background, and I immigrated from Iran, and just kind of some of the obstacles that I had to overcome to, being in this wonderful country and then wrestling. And so anyone that heard the story had always jokingly, I think, commented like, oh, your story needs to be written in a book, or it needs to be a movie. And so that kind of happened for years. And actually at one point when I was in high school, and back then we're talking about in the 80s, hardly any girls wrestled, and only wrestled, if they did wrestle, it was on boys teams. And so it would make, big news. And so, the story of me wrestling boys and a little bit of my background, was published in the newspaper in California where I was living. And, I guess some producers came across the story, read the story, and thought it was really interesting, and approached me to make a movie out of it. And at that time, they bought my story rights, the rights to the story for a year. And it was really cool because I became kind of that popular kid in high school that had this movie production company following me around, right? What 14, 15, 16-year-old doesn't want that in high school, in instant popularity, right? And so it was great. And they followed me around high school and just kind of captured the story and put it in a script format. And at that time, they were hoping to find some investors to turn it into a movie. They didn't know whether to approach like Disney with it or what kind of movie it would be. And so, unfortunately, they didn't also know how to end the story. I was still in high school. Back then, there wasn't a women's national team, and women's wrestling wasn't where it is today. And so, the script kind of sat there, and it's still kind of there, and hopefully someday it'll come across the desk of some, movie production company that's able to turn it into a movie. But in the meantime, kind of as the years passed, and as people kind of knew me and watched me compete and became familiar with my story, like I said, always said, oh, this really needs to be turned into something. And so we never thought anything further of it until, I had the opportunity to coach our women in the Olympics. And right after that, Craig Sesker, who had followed some of my, at the time when I was competing and a little bit after when I was coaching, he was working for USA Wrestling. And so he was familiar with my story. And so since then, as you guys know, Craig is doing a lot of freelance writing and has written many other books. And so Craig was able to approach me and said, how we've joked about, we really need to turn your story into a book. He goes, well, are you ready? Now is as good as time as any. And we just saw it as a great opportunity. And originally we were hoping to finish the book in time for the beginning of the 2020 Olympics for the year, from January, and kind of launch it and into the Olympics, which then, with COVID happening and COVID hitting, we weren't sure whether to release the book or to go ahead and wait and kind of see what happens with the Olympics. But we thought with everyone being homebound and not having much wrestling going on, that it was people needed a good wrestling story, and more than that, people needed a good inspirational story. And so we decided to go ahead and release the book since it was ready.
So much of your story centers around right after the overthrow of the government, where it then became the Islamic Republic of Iran. Those of you who might have seen
Yes.
Argo, that kind of chronicles where it goes from the Kingdom of Iran to the Islamic Republic of Iran, a hardline, very militaristic, type of religious rule. It's it's very documented in the press, and it's in that era coming over to the United States in the 1980s, right after the hostage situation. The book goes to explain the struggles you went through in high school. When you're going back through to explain what happens when you came to the U.S., how many of those memories, kind of flashed back, and how real was it to relive something that happened, several decades ago? I mean, how fresh was it for you?
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting. Some of the memories are so vivid, like it happened yesterday, and I can still see it clear as day. And other, did it really happen the way that I think it happened? And to tell you the truth, when certain chapters were being written the way we did it, Craig Sesker is in Iowa and I'm in California. And so he would call and we would spend hours and hours and hours over the phone. And he would record some of these stories I would tell him, and then he would write it up and email it to me and say, is this correct? And so as we were going through that process, I started questioning myself on some of those, going, did this really happen to me? Like, is this something that I'm just imagining, or did I really live this? Especially, at the time I was, younger, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old during that time period. And so interestingly, I called my mom after one of the interviews I had with Craig. And it's one chapter in particular that, again, it was so just, I could see it in my head and I could envision and walking through it. But then it was so crazy that I questioned if that really happened the way I remembered it happening. And it's the chapter with my aunt in the prison and how they came into the house and the government took her and imprisoned her. And she was my age and a playmate. She was 14 when that happened. And so I called my mom and I said, Mom, this is the story and this is how I remember it. And is this my imagination, or is this how it happened? And so she was able to, it still gives me goosebumps, and to this day, it still makes me very emotional, because she was like, no, that's exactly how it happened. And this is how you remember it. And then she was able to actually add even more detail to some of the stories that maybe I didn't really necessarily remember, that like the really small details. And so like it felt like I was reliving the story, but then I was actually, in writing this book and going through having this book written, I got to find out even more information and details that even I didn't know, because those were conversations that I had not had with my parents, and my parents living through that time and with me, and I was younger. And so I was able to get a lot more information and just realize, wow, that actually did happen, because some of those things just seem so unreal, And I think when the readers read the book, like I said, it's beyond the wrestling story. There's a lot more to this book, and so some of those stories, yeah, absolutely. Some of them are vivid, like it happened yesterday, and others I almost questioned myself whether it happened the way I remember it.
Yeah, it's interesting as we get older as people, the things that we now discuss with our parents as we become adults. As I'm 18, 19, there's certain conversations I wouldn't have with my parents that I'm 40 and I have kids. I'm going to be asking different questions. And the same can be with going through a traumatic experience. I mean, when you look back on your story, do you find it to be more traumatic in hindsight than you remember? You kind of are talking about, did this really happen? But the personal impact on it, I mean, is being able to retell that story. I mean, do you think that maybe your sense of trauma now matches what you felt growing up?
I think so. I think it's once you've experienced trauma like that, or something that's significant, especially at a young age, I think what ends up happening, I'm not a psychologist, but I feel like I had suppressed a lot of that. And so, and now retelling it and reliving it, it's really interesting, Jason, because I find like I can tell you the story and I remember it, but it's not like it happened to me. It's almost like it happened to somebody else. And I just saw it happening. So I don't know if that's like a dissociation or, a way to kind of, deal with that trauma. But it's just really interesting in that when I retell or relive the story, I almost see it as like it happened to somebody else. I know the story, but it wasn't me that was going through it.
A couple things when we get to the wrestling side of it. One is your father, wrestling background in Iran. A lot of people that are wrestling fans here in the United States, we think of Hamid Sorian and Greco-Roman. We think of Yazdani, both of them. We think of the Ali Reza Dabir. We think of the greats. Now, what was your dad's background in wrestling, and that got him that helped you kind of, okay, I'm going to do this, and you got the blessing of wrestling because, to draw a comparison in India, the Dangal movie explains how there was a father that had only had 4 daughters. He's like, oh, what am I going to do? Well, you were the only child here, and you were a daughter.
Exactly, and that's exactly how it happened. Wrestling in Iran is the national sport. Well, I guess as long as you're a man, right? And so my father did want a wrestler to follow in his footsteps. And he was a big wrestler himself. He competed internationally. But, in Iran, they emphasize so much on education as well. So my dad, again, in writing this book, a lot of stories came out that I didn't know. But apparently when my dad was competing in Europe, representing Iran, my grandfather, his father, was also pressuring him on his education and getting his, PhDs and whatnot. And so he had to kind of almost like lie to his dad that, he was still pursuing his education, but meantime, he was wrestling internationally and wrestling all over Europe. And so, that was huge to my father. Wrestling was huge. And so when he waited for his son, so that his son could follow in his footsteps of wrestling, and that never happened. I ended up being his only child, and being a girl, he just figured, well, she's got 2 arms, 2 legs, and just she's it. She's my only hope. And so I think he looked at it that way. He loved wrestling so much, and he wanted his child to follow in his footsteps. But also, to my dad's credit, I will say he was very much a forward thinker. He was not your typical, like what you would think of this strict Iranian father, or like what you said with the movie Dangal. My father had been educated in Europe, and so he was very much more open-minded. And really, he's like, I want to joke that he was like one of the first feminists, because he was like, if a boy can do it, why can't a girl? And so he was my biggest supporter in that. Once he had always wanted a son, but once he had a daughter, he was like, I wouldn't change this for the world. And she can do anything. A son, if I had a son, same thing. She could do anything he could have done. And so he was always had that attitude and been very supportive of me, not only as a female, but in anything I want to pursue, especially wrestling.
As a father of 2 daughters, I'm going to echo those sentiments. Now, when it comes to putting this story down on paper, and I am going to cherry pick certain parts of the story, the book is chronological, which you can get at afsoonwrestling.com. If you're watching here on the stream, you've got the website address right there. I read it over Thanksgiving. It took me a while to get to. I have a stack of books. I felt so bad. It's like, I got to get to it. But I'm just going to cherry pick a couple different things that stood out to me. And then, of course, no spoilers, because you're here. Obviously, it's got a happy ending. Looking at just the opportunity to tell the story. What, you had family that was here, even though you don't have the immediate family of brothers and sisters and such. But what did your family think about the idea of putting this down into a book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And because even I was very hesitant, I mean, to put your whole story, your whole life into a book, it becomes public. And I didn't fully realize, and I'm starting to realize more, it's almost like you're there naked to the world. Like everybody knows every detail about you. In fact, one of my friends that had read the book, but didn't know my parents, I said, oh yeah, my parents, we haven't seen them in such a long time because of COVID. And she said, yeah, how are Manu and Gila doing? And I thought, whoa, how do they know my parents' names? But then I realized, she's like, well, I read your book. I know all about your childhood. And, so there is something to that when you agree or decide to write a book about your life, or, whether it's an autobiography or a biography, and it's your life, you've got to take into consideration that, if you think about that, there's no privacy. Like everyone's going to know everything about you, and you got to be okay with that. But it's one thing that it's about you. It's another one that involves your family members as well. And so, I got my parents' blessing. And the other thing was I fully 100% trusted Craig Sesker. And, we talked a lot prior to me agreeing for him to write this book. Because, you don't know what direction things are going to go. And like I said, I 100% trusted Craig. And so but then I also had to talk to my distant relatives, and especially who I talked to and got the blessing of is my aunt. And again, going back to, there's a very powerful chapter on her and that experience. And without spoiling things too much, I will say she's now in the United States and living in California, Northern California, and I'm in Southern California. But we are in touch now, and we got reconnected. And so I had to make sure that she was okay with me telling, because what she had experienced, because again, that was so traumatic that it involved her. And I will be honest, there was some things that we felt we had to take out. I told Craig, with the Iranian government, we just have to be very careful that this comes from my experience, that we don't share any political beliefs or political ideas, and that, we keep it to my experiences. And so I fully trusted Craig, and I got the blessing of everybody involved, because you've got to be okay with losing your privacy and everyone really knowing everything about you.
And with that being said, if there's a growing push. I believe we've got belt wrestling or something along those lines now available for Iranian women. I'm not exactly sure the style, yes, but it does involve, basically covering every bit of the body. So it resembles wrestling as we know it. But the opportunity, though, I guess this is touched on in the book a little bit. But again, to go back to your homeland doesn't seem to be a reality, does it?
No, in fact, things have improved, definitely, but I feel, with the opportunities opening up with grappling and wrestling and belt wrestling and even some freestyle wrestling in Iran for women, I would have loved to have the opportunity to go and help the women's Iranian wrestlers, and to step foot in Iran and help coach and develop their program. But at this point, at this time, there's something to be said for the safety of your living room couch. And I think in Iran's eyes, I was born in Iran, and I will always in their eyes be Iranian, even though I'm Iranian American. And so I think at this point it's a little bit still risky for me to go back to Iran. And but I would love for the Iranian women wrestlers to, maybe if they're training in Azerbaijan or Turkey or somewhere in a nearby country, I would love to go and see if I could help out and help develop their program.
There's some interesting crossover stories as we go through. When I say crossover, there are names that wrestling fans will immediately recognize throughout the course of this book. And it's just like, it's so cool, on how, and again, these are some spoiler alerts. If you haven't had a chance to sit down and read the book, I highly encourage it. It's probably it's a 2 afternoon read, I think, or you can blow through it if you're really, really immersed into it. That's kind of how wrestling stories are for me. I just get captivated. I'm sitting there, I'm talking to my wife and going, holy crap.
Yeah.
Listen to this. And
Right.
and normally my wife just kind of rolls her eyes when I say, hey, look at this when it comes to wrestling. But, I've kind of leaked this like, hey, look, yeah, she's from Iran. She was on a coaching staff in Rio. It's got this, fleeing the regime kind of thing. And it was just like, and then there's these little things like names that she recognized and she doesn't come from a world of wrestling. I'm like, oh, look at this. And then the two names that jumped out at me were Dan Shade and of course, Marco Sanchez. So those are the crossover. They go, wait a minute. Are you kidding? We were in, I mean, it's just cool how those ties. Now, what was it like to go through the senior level, the beginnings of the senior level when you were still junior age, and then knowing that people that were your high school coach, and then your the person you've double legged to get on the wrestling team who also represented a country at the Olympic game. I mean, there's so many intertwined stories. It's like
so many.
It's like watching a 70s disaster movie on the airplane where everybody's connected in some way. It's like,
isn't that crazy? Yeah,
it's so cool.
We're it's funny because I'm recently on this USA Wrestling Committee, and we were talking about having a diverse committee with different members, and one of the committee members is Eric Guerrero. And like, how diverse is this? We both went to the same high school. We were, he was one of my wrestling practice partners, and yeah, you're right. And not without giving a spoiler, but Marco Sanchez, he's one of the big reasons I even never wrestled, and so, and then, Dan Shade and Dave Schultz used to be in our wrestling. In fact, the leg lace that I did all throughout my career, Dave's the one who taught me that when I was in high school, and then remember the story with John Smith. Like, we're a wrestling community. We're a family. And so it's crazy how you're right. Like you were saying, it intertwines, and there's some really cool stories with big names like that, which at the time, I mean, who knew this is how it was going to turn out?
Yeah, you've got those stories on the wrestling mat. Usually my stories with big names end up, we were in a bar somewhere, and it's not as cool. It's nowhere near as cool.
Yeah, but we had those stories too. But remember I said we left some of it out of the book. That'll be part 2 of the book. Yeah.
Now, getting back to the book, the foreword was written by Dan Gable. So talk about the opportunity to have him involved, and what was your relationship like with Coach Gable prior to him having the opportunity to write the foreword for the book?
Oh, totally. Okay, so Dan Gable, I mean,
were you fangirling out? Were you fangirling about Gable?
Oh, big time fangirling. Not only that, like, are you kidding me? Like, it was just, I mean, because even though I was a girl in high school, I was a wrestler. And so my walls, like where other girls had their walls, like with, fashion or rock stars or whatever, believe it or not, my biggest poster on my room in my high school was that, that poster, Anybody Can Wrestle, and it was Bruce Baumgartner and Tim Vanny. Like that was the posters that I had, and it was all wrestlers that like just legends. And of course, Dan Gable was the biggest legend of all. And so I just was always in awe of Dan Gable. And so here's a funny story. So, here all of a sudden women's wrestling is on the senior national level, and all of a sudden we're competing in the very first world championships alongside the men's national team, and everybody whose posters I had up on my wall, all of a sudden I'm competing on the mat next to them in Martigny, Switzerland, and at the 1989 World Championships. And I'm thinking, I'm just a high school kid, about to graduate high school, and these guys have been like the legends whose posters I've had on my wall, and Afsoon Roshanzamir on mat 1, and John Smith on mat 2. I'm like, what? And so and then of course Dan Gable. And so then things progress with women's wrestling, and we end up having the athletes representative on the USA Wrestling Board of Directors. And 20% need to be athletes, and it needs to be represented by all 3 women's freestyle, and men's Greco. All three styles had to be represented. So I ended up being elected as a women's wrestling representative on the USA Wrestling Board. And lo and behold, who's also on the board is Dan Gable. And so at that time, you know, we would have 2 meetings a year in person to kind of strategize and go over board business and USA Wrestling business. And like you were saying, I was like totally fangirl. So here we are at the same board, and I just looking over across going, I can't believe I'm in the same room as Dan Gable. And I remember even asking him for a picture. So, and you know, this was like early 90s. And so, you know, as things kind of progressed, I've been able to see Dan Gable at different venues and just events and tournaments and things like that. And since he's become such a big supporter of, I mean, he loves all wrestling, supports all wrestling and, you know, women's wrestling. Craig and I talked, and I thought, you know, who I would be absolutely honored, and especially with his history of wrestling Iranian wrestlers, said I would be absolutely honored if Dan Gable would do the forward. And so it happened.
There are some crazy stories, and some humorous and some very, very, I guess for lack of a better term, dark when in terms of the things that are told. One of which is, you know, some of us may look at what we see on the news and know, well, is this real, or is this propaganda? What is actually happening in Tehran with the burning of the flags, the death to America? How hard was it for you to tell that part of the story here?
Yeah. So, my goodness, it wasn't hard for me to tell that part of the story because, like, those are the images and those are the things that I remember so clearly, because when I was that young and when I was in Iran during that time, it was impressionable years. It was when I was in grade school, and they were doing a great job of brainwashing that generation, brainwashing kids that age. And so, I mean, that was my school routine every morning. Remember doing that and burning the flag and stomping in death to the United States. So that's actually memories that I remember firsthand, and I can confirm firsthand it wasn't propaganda. I lived it. I remember that. And I remember those stories, those things very, very clearly, because that was my daily routine during those impressionable years. And like I said, it was definitely brainwashing. And it wasn't until I came to the United States, you know, in junior high and high school, and I looked back at my elementary school years and thought, wow, I can't believe they did that to elementary school age kids. And that's what they were feeding us, and that's what they were leading us to believe. And so firsthand, when I moved to the United States, I was like, this isn't how they described it. This isn't what they were telling us. Like, the United States is not this great Satan that, you know. And so it was interesting because I got to experience it for me firsthand. So what you saw on TV in the late 70s and in the 80s, absolutely is what was happening in Tehran.
And you mentioned, you know, you come to the United States, this isn't the great. Now, and you say that knowing that high school and junior high is difficult for kids, no matter what differences they have. So you're saying, I mean, you know, the adjustment for you probably wouldn't have been a stretch to be like, okay, this place does kind of suck. So what was some of the hardships you had to do with, first of all, learning English? That's the one thing, because going from Farsi, from mine, I look at them, I got nothing. I got squiggles. I got nothing. And then we hear that English is typically a hard language for people that don't speak it as their first language to learn, based on just because we have words that mean the same thing. One word means 5 different things. So I guess what was that the biggest struggle? Was the language, or was it just, you know, adapting socially?
Believe it or not, the language I picked up in 2 months. I like to talk, and so I figured it's survival mode. You know, I'll tell you, I went from in 6th grade what they call an ESL class, English as a Second Language class, where half the day I was in the normal 6th grade classroom, and then they would pull you out the second half of the day. They would put you at this ESL classroom, which English as a Second Language. So basically, I remember they would show me like flashcards, like, this is a cat. Can you say cat? You know, and I remember that, like, going 6th grade to that ESL class to 7th grade, I was actually in an honors English class. And so in that 1 year, I was able to not only learn the English language, but also then be, you know, in an honors program. by the next year. So the language was actually the easiest part. Boy, the culture, the society that, in junior high years, let me tell you, I think I was nearly just as traumatized from that, honestly, as what I went through in Iran. Because I'll tell you what, in Iran, they separated boys and girls, right? So I was not able to be in contact with a boy whatsoever. I wasn't able to talk to boys. I wouldn't have known how to interact with a boy. It just was a really strange thing. And again, I didn't have any brothers, and so to go from that, a classroom of all girls where you're covered up and have no interaction with boys, to all of a sudden in a sixth grade co-ed classroom where the hormones are starting, boys and girls are starting to notice each other, and I'm the different kid. I'm the kid that doesn't dress the same. I have this thick accent. People ask me, where are you from? And I say Iran, and they go, oh, you terrorists, get out, Oh, because at that time it was right after the American hostage crisis. So to say Iran, to be Iranian was a bad thing, And then honestly, like, we left everything behind. So to go from having comfortable things, at my own bedroom and whatnot, to selling everything and leaving everything behind, to coming in, having basically the clothes on my back and nothing else. So basically really poverty. And I remember and kids just being so mean and like throwing things at me and just saying, to like every single myself to bed. And going, I hate this. And it wasn't that I blamed the United States. It wasn't that. It was that it was tough being that different kid, to be excluded, to be made fun of, to be that different. And I wanted to go back. And my mom was saying, you trust me, you don't want to go back. At least your life's not in danger here. I go, Erin, you don't go to junior high. You don't know how tough it is there. And so, where I excelled, or where things got better, was one, I learned the language quickly, but two, it was anytime sports were involved, and that was when I was finally accepted. And that was when I finally wasn't the weird kid and people did want me on their team. And so it was almost like I had to learn about the society, and I had to reinvent myself. And wrestling was a huge part of that, and huge part of my identity. And that's why I think wrestling was such a huge part of that.
Well, it's interesting too, because you say that, you're the different kid, and then you do something that at the time was let's even make you more different. Let's put
Right.
The foreign kid is now the only girl on the wrestling team, which thankfully here we are in 2020 going into 2021. That's no longer that story is no longer a freak show type of newspaper story. It's not it's not, oh, let's do a story about this one abnormality in a wrestling program. And I don't mean that
no, but I was the freak show. Mm-hmm. I was definitely the freak show. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And boy, so this is what happened. So like, I guess I don't learn the easy way, or I don't do things the easy way, right? So
that's wrestling. It's not easy.
And you know what? Wrestling, it's not for just your average normal person. Because in wrestling, I think if you are unique and you are different, and you're on the mat by yourself, right? Mm-hmm. It's you. So you have to really, again, reinvent yourself and be that unique individual, I think. But so I struggled in sixth grade and was that different kid and had to reinvent myself. And so as a freshman in high school, I ended up going to a new high school, Independence High School. So new kids, no one knew me from junior high. And it was my chance to reinvent myself and become this popular All-American girl. And so I went out for cheerleading, because that's what popular All-American girls do in high school, right? But again, that was too easy. And I'm watching wrestling and I'm going, wait, I don't want to do this. I want to do that, the wrestling. And that's what I had grown up with, right? And so you're right. Back then, girls just didn't do that. Even in the United States, like, girls didn't wrestle. And so when I went out for the boys' high school team of my high school, I was the only girl. I was that freak show. There were no other girls in that area that were doing what I was doing. And so it was like, all over again. Yeah. And I got a lot of criticism and a lot of negativity. Mind you, this is early 80s, right? And so I remember this is before like cell phones, before the internet. And so when the media was covering my wrestling, they were covering it kind of like, look at this freak sideshow. And I remember one article saying, what the great sport of wrestling doesn't need is a sideshow that resembles mud wrestling. And that quote just really stood out in my head, because at that time, that was kind of the thought, like, what does this girl think what she's doing? And I remember my dad sitting in one of my tournaments as I'm wrestling, and he hears the people behind him talking, going, why doesn't she go and play with her Barbie dolls? She needs to go home and play with her dolls. Like, that was kind of the general idea, the general opinion of the public with seeing a girl out on the wrestling mat wrestling a boy. It's just like, what does she think she's doing? And so even like I said, it was before the internet, but there was the white pages or whatever where you could find people's phone number, and our phone was ringing off the hook with like threats and like and even the Iranian community at the time was telling my dad, like, you're an Iranian man. How are you allowing your daughter to roll around with boys on, in public? Like, there was a lot of criticism and negativity that first year of me wrestling. And so it was a long process to win people over. But I'll tell you, Jason, the greatest thing for me is I'm so glad in my lifetime, I'm able to see how far women's wrestling to where we went from being like a single sideshow, to now a legitimate Olympic sport with United States bringing home medals. And it's just amazing to see. And it's just I still think we have a ways to go as far as, equality. And there's some things that still, I think we need to work on. But all in all, how far we've come in the last 30 years, if you had asked me that 30 years ago, I would have never in my wildest dreams would have imagined we would come this far. So I'm glad that I'm still alive to see it.
I got 2.5 stories that I want to get to, and they're all basically recent. One is kind of coming across what you just said. I've been covering Fargo, the Junior Cadet Nationals, since 1999. So it was a 22-year streak, I believe, 22 years uninterrupted until COVID. So I saw the first junior women's championship in Fargo, 2002. And I remember seeing Mary Kelly going out there. She was the girl wrestling against the boys. And I tell this story a lot, and Melinda Ripley gets a lot of mileage out of it because she beat Mary Kelly. And that was the one that opened my eye, like, there are more. It's not just the one girl against the boys is good. These are the girls against the girls that are good. And here's the thing: we now have cadets and juniors that are aged up to the point where they were born after that tournament started, so they're going through an entire wrestling life, not knowing that they didn't have that opportunity before. So that's cool. You've gotten to see that unfold. And I want to go back to 2000. I want to say 2013, because I think it was around the Save Olympic Wrestling movement, where they brought all the women's trailblazers together in Las Vegas. I think that's my time. And that's the first time I had met you. And I really got to know your story because I'd read the story about, Lisa Whitsitt. She had the book that I had read, and then I got to meet you and Marie, and I had known Trisha a little bit. So getting to see that group, and then I'm coming through with Sarah and Jenny. They're kind of in my age group, and Christy. So Christy Davis. And so that was my generation coming through, and then to see what you guys had to go through, and then hear about it and read it about it. And again, Lisa's book, now in your book to also complement it, and then to fill in the story with Marie's story that's tied in. It's just really cool to see it develop. Now, when you look at coaching in Rio, the picture of you walking out with Haley is like, it's like one of those, it's like that iconic image, the way to see it is one thing, to live it is another. And I guess, how do you try to put a moment like that in words to know that you were different, didn't know the language, didn't know how to wrestle, you're the first woman to win a medal, and now you're in the corner in the same Olympic Games that Helen becomes the first American woman to win a gold medal for the country. I mean, there are so many Hollywood storylines to this. How do you really put it into words? Right.
It's surreal. You don't put it into words. You put it in a book, right?
You put it into a lot of words. Yes.
Yeah. But here's where I think what you just said, I think, is so important for this generation of wrestlers to read and to know about. It's so important because they don't have that history. This new generation of girl wrestlers, and really all wrestlers, but I think the girl wrestlers today need to know a little bit of their history, need to know a little bit of these stories. It's so important for them to read my book, Lisa's book, the Wrestle Like a Girl book, and be familiar with their history while we're still even alive. I think I told Rich Bender this. I said, hey, I don't know how much longer we'll be alive. We're like kind of the grandmas of the sport at this point, but while we're alive, let's put this into the history of women's wrestling so that the next generations know the beginnings, know how it started, and then appreciate what they have, not take things for granted. You see a lot of sport, that movie, A League of Their Own?
Big fan.
I cry every time I see that movie. Because I can so relate to that, and like that was the history and time where those women, and then the scene at the end where they're all older and they get together and like look back at it, and like that's what it reminds. Like that used to be our playground, back in the 80s. That was the MAC. That was our playground, and those are the memories. And while we're still alive, I think that needs to be captured and needs to be written down, and this new generation needs to learn about it while we still have it, and while we're still alive, because like 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now, they won't know if it's not taught or written down.
We talk about wrestling. You brought it up about the poster. Wrestling is for anybody, and we see that with shapes, sizes, colors, creeds, whatever. Yeah. And we talk about diversity and people that look like you, and that doesn't just mean the color of your skin. There's still the situation where women still are trying to break through certain glass ceilings, not just in sports, but overall. But when you see a little girl who is interested in the sport of wrestling, how important is it for them to see somebody that looks like them teaching?
Oh yeah, it is. It's absolutely, it's so important. And so that's why the stars of women's wrestling today, what I talk to them about is I don't just coach them on the mat or whatever. I talk to them a lot about things off the mat. And it's now their responsibility to give back to the sport. And the way you give back is to step in and be that role model that these little girls can relate to, and be that coach that fully understands. I mean, don't get me wrong, male coaches, Terry Steiner, incredible, absolutely incredible. And, nothing to take away from that whatsoever. But I do think that what you just said, it is very important for these little girls to see role models that look like them in successful places, and whether it's in leadership roles, whether it's with an Olympic gold medal around their neck. And so it is absolutely, I think Adeline does a fantastic job of that, in like becoming a really good role model and getting her face out there and connecting with a lot of our senior women. Do a really good job. And I think that there's that certain responsibility that as a female wrestler, if you're one of our stars or have had success within our sport, that it's so important to give back and reconnect with these young girls, because that's our next generation. And if we don't do that, then our sport can die down, right? We, like you said, in 2013, we experienced that could happen if we don't do our due diligence, if we just assume, oh, wrestling's there to stay and no one can touch wrestling. That's not true. I mean, we have to put back into our sport. The sport wrestling has given us a lot. We need to give back. And the way you give back is by being role models and carrying this next generation, these younger generation. And that they're our future. They're the future of our sport and its success.
You'd said the word grandma, and that's kind of one of the buzzwords. I kind of use it in a different situation. I say, of course, people look about, well, nobody's watching women's wrestling, blah, blah, blah. Well, there's 100 years of NCAA wrestling that we've got on the men's side. And I say this, and it's soon I'm not going to be able to say it anymore. Nobody's grandma wrestled, but we're starting to get there. I'm not going to throw any of those trailblazers under the bus, but at the same point, I use Jake Pataxel, who was an All-American at Purdue, as an example. His grandfather, I believe, was a national champion in 1950, an NCAA champion. So women don't have that yet. And when we look at, we're barely 30 years old in terms of the international scene, and we're past the again the tiaras and the vacuum cleaners as gifts and such that's been so well outlined at tournaments and things like prettiest wrestler from the International Federation. Thankfully those are things of the past, but again, there's you've 30 years where the rest of the sport has centuries. So I guess in the time we got left in bringing it all to the struggle, the fight through the book, the struggle and the fight for women's wrestling isn't necessarily against wrestling. It's just the struggle and the fight to have that opportunity to wrestle. And what is your ultimate? What would make you, I guess, the happiest when it comes to? All right, you can look back 20 years from now and go, okay, remember what it used to be like. What is your perfect baseline when we get to wrestling, say 20 years from now?
Yeah, some of it has already happened, actually. It's what you mentioned with Fargo, going into see mats and mats of look in the bracket sizes of these girls wrestling and seeing the numbers and seeing how the numbers grow. Like that to me is like, okay, that's kind of my legacy, is just like how girls wrestling and women's wrestling has grown. It like legitimizes what I did and all the hardships and all the criticism that like, okay, we weren't a freak show. It wasn't, look at how far it's come. And also, what was really, really cool was another moment it's happened several times at several big tournaments, whether it was the California State Championships I saw this happen at, or actually the Olympic trials before Rio. As matches were going on and there was like women's matches on one mat and men's matches on the other mat, people were actually more interested in the wrestling and the level of wrestling that was happening on the women's matches when a men's match was going on at the same time. So basically that's telling me the level is getting to where people are enjoying watching the quality of women's wrestling and how far it's come. And so that to me has just been amazing. Now where it goes 30 years from now, hopefully to where women's wrestling and men's wrestling is equal in every single aspect, in numbers and in quality and in everything. And like I said, it's already come so far, more than I expected. So I'm pretty happy to see what's happening.
Lastly, I mentioned Helen, which to me has, I was the PA announcer in Rio when that happened, and it was one of those situations where I get asked, like, what's your favorite match and whatnot. And without a doubt, the most amazing moment of my career in that role is watching Helen and getting to say, ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the national anthem of the United States of America. It gets me, I get the feels, I get all it takes me back there. But you were the first. You've got the first medal. Do you ever sit there and think, man, without you, there isn't a second. Without Helen, there's not going to be a second. There's not going to be the ones to fall in line. So how much credit do you give yourself for being the true trailblazer at the world stage for the United States?
Well, thank you for saying that. But to be honest, I didn't even realize that was a historic first world medal until Gary Abbott. I give Gary credit for that. Gary Abbott went back and looked and said, that medal you got, that was the first historic medal for the United States. And so that was really cool because at the time I didn't even know, and I wouldn't have ever known had Gary Abbott not noticed that and mentioned that to me. So that's pretty cool. But I'll tell you, for me, it came full circle in that, I was part of United States first world medal, and then to be there in person, full circle, to witness, and be on the coaching staff for the United States first Olympic gold medal. There's finally an end to the book. There's finally the full story and the full fulfillment. I would have loved to have had the opportunity to compete in the Olympics, but the timing wasn't there for me. But to be able to be a part of that, to watch in person when, like you were saying, you were there as well, to see Helen accomplish that and have that first ever Olympic gold medal around her neck for the United States. That's, again, something, like you said, never forget. You never forget.
You can dig deeper into Afsoon's story. Of course, we've just hit some of the key points of the book. AfsoonWrestling.com. You can pick it up. It'll be a great after Christmas read, or something you need to, now that we've got some wrestling popping up around the country. We're seeing Division I kicking off. In terms of the collegiate season, we've had wrestling going on since November nationwide, but you need a book for that bus ride. You need a book for your daughter. You need a book for your niece. You need a book for your son or your son, your nephew. This isn't just about a girl story. This is more than just a wrestling story. So AfsoonWrestling.com, and Afsoon, I'll give you, the former Sue Roshanzamir, as you went by back in the day. Give you the last word here as we wrap up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, I would love to get this book in the hands of every reader. It is a very easy, as you said, Jason, very easy, quick read. It's a great story. And I'll add something. If you do send me a message or whatnot to that Afsoon Wrestling or Afsoon Johnston, Afsoon Roshan Johnston, I'll go ahead and sign the book over to you and put a little memo or a little note in the front of it and personalize it for you. So it's a great read. Hopefully you'll look into, it makes a great gift, as you said, Jason, and I think it's a pretty good story.
I do as well, and I'll probably end up reading it again. So for Afsoon Johnston, I'm Jason Bryant. Thanks for watching, and check out the book again, AfsoonWrestling.com.
Thank you, Jason.